I did not know that feminists had this much of an issue with fish, especially female fish. That seems a little bit interesting, but okay. Anyway, I won't. No judgment.
Yeah. So the piece is about the assumption that fish and shrimp, as well as lesser invertebrates like insects, can feel pain. It's argued that this is very unlikely. Okay, so a first point that she makes is she says before I proceed, I want to note that there is a default belief among many well-meaning environmentalists that empathy for animals requires assuming that their experience of the world is roughly similar to our own. This is an understandable position, but I think we should also be clear that a desire to show empathy for animals should not lead anyone to endorse bad science, as the facts suggest that animals, like shrimp and fish, do not experience pain in the way we do, nor should we malign scientists as cruel or uncaring if those scientists make good faith arguments to show that it is unlikely to be the case that these animals feel pain. So I think broadly, presumably, we'd agree with that.
Broadly agree with it. Just know, not that this contradicts that. Just like I don't think either of us operate with that assumption. That one must think their experience is comparable in order to have empathy for them, even if it's not comparable. It's fine.
Okay, so what do you make of this first claim that this culture and shaming and attacking of those skeptical of fish invertebrate pain should lead us to be skeptical of claims that the debate is completely settled in the pro-fish direction?
Wait, hold on. Let me read this claim again. So she's saying there's a culture of shaming and attacking those skeptical of fish and invertebrate pain, and because that exists, it should lead us to be skeptical of claims that the debate is completely settled in pro-pain direction. Okay, so two claims. That one is that there is a culture, and two, if there is a culture, then that's reason for us to be skeptical that the debate is settled. I'm not really. Maybe there is this culture. I haven't. So as far as the first claim goes, that there is a culture of shaming and attacking people who are skeptical of invertebrate pain. Maybe there is a culture of that. If there is, I certainly haven't been much exposed to it. I don't. But even if that is true, even if there is a culture, I don't know why that would give us reason to think that the debate is not settled. Like there's a culture of shaming Holocaust deniers, for example, at least in some areas, and I don't think that means that there is reason to believe that the debate over whether the Holocaust happened is not settled. At least I assume she would agree with that. Maybe some people, I know some people who don't, there's unfortunately, but yeah, so I'm not sure that the fact that there's a culture, even if there is a culture of shaming something, that there's a reason that in itself is a reason to believe that their debate is settled in any direction.
Yeah, no, right. It may give you like a weak reason for skepticism. But then there are also lots of biases in the other direction, right? So, fish are sort of, they look very different from us. They're very different from us. So like there are all sorts of biases that you might expect to work in one of the directions. There might be self-interested biases from scientists, most of whom eat fish, where they wouldn't want to acknowledge fish sentience. So overall, like I think the most productive thing is just to look at the arguments on both sides and not rely too much on these like higher order meta questions about, who would we on which direction would we expect the evidence to be biased, especially when we just look at the fact that there's been this kind of long historical record. Like if you just look at the inductive trend of whether we've generally thought more animals or fewer animals are conscious over time, generally the trend is towards more. So that's a reason to be.
True. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the case against fish and invertebrate pain. So the argument has basically four steps. And it's given by Brian Key and other neuroscientists. So step one is pain is a product of the brain. I assume we agree with that.
We agree. Yes.
Yes. Two, in particular, for pain to exist in an organism, the brain in the organism must sustain the sorts of neurological features that allow for consciousness and pain perception. In humans, this is the cortex, which performs the signal amplification and information necessary for any particular nerve firing to be felt as pain.
Ooh, we're already going to Okay, so first sentence of two, I agree. So that first sentence, in particular, for pain to exist in an organism, the brain of the organism must sustain the sorts of neurological features that allow for consciousness and pain perception. Well, that almost tautologically, I agree.
I guess I might disagree for a very nitpicky reason where, and maybe this would make me disagree very slightly with one. I agree that pain in actual organisms is a byproduct of the brain, but there might be like non-brain
Sure,
structure,
she
like
might be.
artificial
I
stuff.
don't think she's saying for all pain that exists, pain's a product of the brain. Just like she could just say the pain that we know of is a product of the brain.
Yeah, sure,
Or
okay.
pain broadly is a product of the brain. But so the first sentence of 2 is almost tautological. It's essentially to say, it says, in particular, for pain to exist in organs, the brain of the organism must sustain certain sorts of neurological features that allow for consciousness and pain perception. Well, that's sort of like saying, in order for pain to exist, the brain, in order for pain to exist, if you already have one in the background, that pain is a product of the brain, just saying that the brain has to be of the sort that allows pain for pain to exist.
Right.
That
It would be
doesn't really add.
surprising if it would be surprising if pain only existed in brains, but for reasons having nothing to do with what the brain does. But yeah.
But you see, like, if you have one in the background, pain is a product of the brain, that sentence saying, well, in order for pain to exist, the brain has to be of the sort that allows pain. Well, yeah. I mean, if the brain didn't allow pain, there wouldn't be pain. If the brain did allow pain, there would be pain. So I don't see how this does any. That just seems like a tautologically true.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So, and then the next sentence is, in humans, this is the cortex, which performs the signal amplification and integration necessary for particular nerve findings to be felt as pain. Okay, so I agree that's how this generally happens for almost all humans. I don't agree that's required for every human. I think there are humans that experience pain without cerebral cortex. Sometimes in totality, sometimes in non-totality, but the remaining cortex is so damaged and has no functional connections to the rest of the brain anyway, and there's no activity in the residual cortex. You can look up in cases not hydrocephaly, but hydrancephaly, not to be confused with hydrocephaly, hydrancephaly, and there are individuals that we consider to be sentient that don't have cortices, they don't have cerebral cortex. They do things that we would recognize. They recognize their parents. They're able to engage in very ways that if we didn't know about the cerebral cortex, we would say they're sentient. I also don't agree with that in terms of fetal development.
Are there people with hydrancephaly who can speak, for example?
They can. My understanding is they can speak. Now they don't engage in the same way that. Look, they're going to be mental. They're going to have. They're going to be mentally handicapped in some severe ways because they don't have a cerebral cortex. Well, they can speak. They're not going to have, and they're not going to be able to speak in the ways that they have a language center and like as we know it in they're not going to have a temporal lobe, so that's going to severely limit their ability to speak. So their form of speaking is going to be very language limited, if that's what you're asking. If I don't know how much language is built into your definition of speak there, but they can make noises in a sort of communicative way. They have recognition, but their language abilities are going to be very strongly impaired because they don't have a temporal lobe, because they don't have a cortex. So they're not going to be talking like you or I are talking. Obviously, nothing like that.
They'll talk maybe more like the way T-Jump talks.
There you go. Exactly. There. Yeah. So, right. So, and also, I don't agree that this is also. It's not clear to me that this would be true in developing humans. Which, by the way, I'm not surprised that now I kind of understand why. Sort of, I didn't understand the connection between feminism here and fetal pain, but now I do because not fetal pain because with fish pain, because now I do, because this same sort of argument that a cerebral cortex is required for pain is actually one of the arguments that are made by pro-choice advocates. So I understand the feminist tie-in here. That may make a little bit more sense. So the feminists, some feminists like to make this argument for pro-choice positions by stating that it is not possible for a fetus to feel pain because they don't have, at a certain point in development, they just don't have thalamocortical connections. And that, to me, does not work. I understand the motivation, but no, there's the assumption that even if we take it to be true that adult humans require a cerebral cortex to feel pain, it doesn't follow from that non-adult or fetal humans require cerebral cortex to feel pain. It could simply be the functionality of a different part of the brain before that. But even more so, we actually observe fetuses that develop with malformations such that they don't develop a cortex, and they do operate as if they feel pain. And we have every reason to believe that they feel pain, at least from any other mentally handicapped or any other mentally handicapped to a similar degree individual that does have a cerebral cortex in terms of the way they behave, in terms of the way they're.
Yeah. So, what are some of the in the hydrancephaly cases? Like, what are some? So, you mentioned they can recognize their parents' faces.
Let's go through. I mean, yeah, there's papers. In fact, there's actually papers here. I don't know if are you in the have you gone through the study archive Non-Cortical Sentience? Let's see.
I started reading one.
Yeah.
I have a lot of things to read for my upcoming blog post about fish sentience, but
sure. Yeah, so you can maybe share this. I'll shoot this over to you in Discord. Maybe you can pull it up. Here's a paper. It's called "Consciousness in Congenitally Decorticate Children: Developmental Vegetative State as Self-Fulfilling Prophecy."
Okay.
And so there's photographs. So like figure 2, subject 1 visually tracking a hand puppet, so they can visually track things. And then discrimination of persons. When received into foster care age 1 to 6 months, subject who showed no interaction with persons or environment. From then on, she received constant affection and multimodal stimulation from her foster mother and therapist. For the next half year, she remained unresponsive even to this enriched environment. Gradually, however, both mother and therapist noticed that she seemed more at ease in her own home than elsewhere. By age 5, she consistently recognized certain individuals non-visually and responded to people differently according to 3 categories: mother, familiar persons, and strangers. The more familiar someone was, the more she would relax, move spontaneously, and vocalize. At age 6 years, a neurosurgeon described her as happy and very responsive to her mother. At age 12 years, GLH noticed that she smiled, turned to sound, and seemed to enjoy music. She was aware of mother's presence and became upset if separated. On PAB's first home visit, the patient grew anxious at his approach and withdrew fearfully when he gently took hold of her arm, but calmed to comforting her mother. During the joint visit of DAS and PAB, she seemed to enjoy being stroked by her mother and was relaxed by a familiar music therapist. But when DAS approached, speaking soothingly and touching her as gently as possible, she became tense and apprehensive, with a change in respiratory pattern and more eye deviation toward her mother on the other side of the bed. Now, this appears similar to this a form of a mentally handicapped state that we recognize as having not the same form of sentience that we have, but some lower order form of it, but not nothing. And not one that seems that they don't feel pain. And one could always come up with some sort of objection and say, okay, well, we can explain away all of these reactions. We can explain away all of this data that appears to the contrary by saying, okay, well, maybe it's just nociception and it's not pain. Maybe it's just this fiber. We can do all of that. We can do all the Rose and Key moves, but the problem is we don't do that in cases where the individual is corticate and displaying the same behavior. We recognize that we have this view that they probably are feeling pain. And so if the point of contention is whether the cortex is required or not, unless you're begging the question, it doesn't seem like you're gonna either have to bite the bullet and say that the corticate children who display similar behavior are not sentient and they don't feel pain, or you're going to have to say that the decorticate children are sentient and they do feel pain, or you're going to have some sort of symmetry breaker here. And the symmetry breaker can't be the presence or absence of a cortex, because that's what's in contention in the first place.
Yeah. I think that's like, it looks like in the case of some decorticate children, they're like, in terms of their cognitive functions, they're pretty similar to like young babies that are like pre-verbal. And And so basically, if you think that just when interacting with a young baby, it's like really obvious that they're conscious, then I think you should also think this here. Like if you think it's just that that based on the way they behave with a young baby, you should think that they're conscious, that they can recognize their mother, they grow visibly distressed when they're outside the home, or when they're in a place they don't recognize. It seems like you should think, they smile at things. It seems like then you should think a similar thing about decorticate children. So I guess, so the main argument
point the paper makes in the title a self-fulfilling prophecy. One of the things that it postulates is that they sort of notice that in environments where people have already come to the conclusion that the babies weren't sentient because they didn't have a cortex, they ended up treating them in a way in which they weren't sentient. They gave them very little interaction, very little care, and then they ended up behaving that way because they got no stimulation. But the ones where they didn't have that assumption in the background, they didn't say, oh, well, the baby doesn't have a cortex, I guess we have to, toss out that idea that it's sentient, and they treat it as if it were sentient. They actually behaved as if they're sentient. It's like, which is, by the way, how a lot babies normally develop. If you deprive a baby of stimulation, it has a lot of problems in the way they behave later. They parts of their brains, if you do it enough, parts of their brains may not develop properly. And one point the paper makes in terms of the damage of this, the harm of this belief is that this actually becomes not a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because, so it's not that there's any truth to the claim that decorticate children are not sentient. It's that it's not true, and it becomes true when you actually abuse children by stimuli deprivation because of this horrible belief that a cortex is required for sentience. So you've actually put the baby in a form of child abuse because you didn't think it was sentient, because you can't abuse something not sentient, right? So the point is that it's led. This is a belief that has led to child abuse in a sense.
So I was going over a paper. So Brian Key, who's the main author who she cites, he wrote a paper called "Why Fish Do Not Feel Pain," and he gave a few arguments.
I've read that paper, but yes,
and he gave a few arguments for why he thought that the cortex was needed in humans. So maybe we could go over those. So the first one is, he says, in humans, when we're in pain, the cortex is very active. So he cites a paper by Segerdal that used arterial spin laving, quantitative perfusion imaging to quantify cortical neural activity. They demonstrated a specific role of the dorsal posterior insular cortex in pain sensation. So basically, what there seems to be a fairly robust correlation between cortical activity and degree of pain, and so he uses this to support for the idea that the cortex is needed for.
Yeah. So let's just deal with that one first. So no one disputes that in adult humans, barring some sort of deformity, that there's activity in the cortex when pain is introduced, when painful stimuli are introduced. No one's going to put that in contention, and no one's even going to contend that the cortex is playing a even potentially necessary role in pain for that individual. It is the jump from that to say that, well, in all individuals, and in all stages of development and in all species, that is a requirement. So, for example, let's say that I need my hands to type to you. I don't think I could type with my feet, but with my toes. But however, if I was born without hands, I probably would have grown up getting very good at typing with my toes. And whereas if I tried typing with my toes now, I might never get good at typing with my toes. There may be some sort of changeover that happens in earlier development that lets me do that. So the point is that just because right now it's required for me to type with my hands, it doesn't follow from that it's always required for humans to type with their hands. We agree that it's like the way the brain is develops in humans. It's a requirement for adult humans and most children, to have a cerebral cortex to feel pain. It doesn't follow from that in all developmental conditions, a cerebral cortex is required for pain. So it doesn't follow for all humans it's required for pain. Nor does it follow that it would extrapolate to species that never develop a cortex.
Right. I think what this merely shows is that at least in typical humans, the cortex plays a major role in conscious experience of pain. But you can't go from that to thinking that humans need it any more than in the analogy you gave. Normally hands play a major role in typing, but that doesn't mean that hands are needed for typing. So we should conclude that if aliens don't have hands, it would just be impossible in principle for them.
For another species, exactly. Like there's the nail on the head. Like it's even less. Like we can imagine that, if I was born without hands, that there may be some sort of alternate developmental pathway I would go through to adapt in such a way where I would just get really good at moving my toes that I would never be able to do now and use something else to type. But it even follows less if we extrapolate it to other species. As you said, like if aliens came down and be like, well, the information that aliens don't have hands doesn't give us reason to think that they can't type because they lack the necessary requirements to type. They could have all sorts of other appendages they could type. They may be able to type with, who knows? Or maybe some appendages that we have, they could type with somehow that we don't usually type with because they just have a different function.
Right. So then a second argument that Key gives is,
and the major point, by the way, the major point is, again, going back to the paper, we've observed this. Like we've observed. This is also something that we see. Like we see what happens when we prevent, like when there's conditions that prevent cortical development. It's like, okay, well, it turns out that sort of thing kind of does happen. Like just like I kind of would type with my toes if I had to. Like these kids kind of do just have this different processing where it appears they're processing brain and really feeling it in other areas that have assumed that function.
And does it look like they feel pain? Like do they seem to respond?
Yeah. So, well, here's the thing. So the answer is yes. It does look like feel pain. Now there's always an objection that the Rosen, Key, and acolytes would love to bring, which is there's always going to be this distinction between, nociception and pain, emotions and feelings. There's always going to be a distinction between the sensory pathway and the actual conscious experience. So, so the best we could say is they look like they're feeling pain. Now, there's always this underdetermination about whether it's just nociception or whether it's actual pain.
Right, but of course that's always present, right? You can always think, like, maybe you don't feel, maybe Brian Key doesn't feel pain. Maybe he just has nociception and withdraws. Yeah.
And then we go back to the symmetry breaker with the cortex not being appealed to without question begging.
Yeah. So, and then Key gives two other arguments, but I basically think what you've said so far will apply to these. So his two other arguments are, first of all, when you have a lesion of the cortex, then that seems to knock out sensation of pain.
If you cut my hands off, it knocks out typing. Same response, doesn't follow.
Right. And then the third one is, he says, direct electrical stimulation of the cortex in awake patients undergoing brain surgery causes them to feel pain.
If you stimulate electrically my hands, you can cause me to type. Still doesn't follow.
Right. So I basically think this is right. And I guess one other thing I'd say is, I think if you're like agnostic about fish sentience, then this is enough to take their interest really seriously. Like if you think that there's even like a 20% chance, then you should take their interest really seriously. And so at best, these arguments seem deeply inconclusive. So like I don't agree with the Key position, but I can sort of get into the like mindset of like at least weakly leaning towards the Key position, where you're like, this view's kind of plausible. This is where I'd, be at 55% on. But it seems utterly insane to be like, I'm so astronomically certain both that the cortex is needed in humans and that in animals
it's needed univocally across all species. It's like,
right. Yes. I'm just so astronomically certain in this that it makes me think it's just okay to kill fish by the trillions, to kill shrimp by the hundreds of billions and so on.
And to really just do anything we want with them. You don't have to just kill them. You can poke holes into them and watch them squirm. There really is no limit if they're not conscious, because you think a cortex is necessary. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, I did actually. Amusingly, I heard Brian Key's response to this was, he says, well, even if they're not conscious, buildings aren't conscious, but nature is not conscious, but you might still think nature has intrinsic value. But
Well,
but we normally don't care about the like, I mean, I don't think nature has intrinsic value, but even if you do think nature has intrinsic value, we don't normally care deeply about the welfare of nature. Like, we just sort of like that it exists, right?
yeah,
So this won't give us reasons to like try not to not inflict pain on fish, right? But I think at the very least you should be sufficiently uncertain about this. Like, you shouldn't be 99% in either direction. You could maybe be like 80%, like 70-80% is where roughly where I would be at in fish being conscious.
yeah.
But
I'm 80. I'm 80. I'm at least 80% credence that fish are sentient, at least in some way, at least in some meaning,
yeah,
non-trivial way.
yeah, okay, right. So we agree that these aren't very convincing. Um, uh, right, and
I hate
sorry,
to
and
say that's going to be it, Matthew, but I actually think this is the thrust of the whole fucking argument, and there's really not much else they give. Like the rest they give, the rest Rose and Key gives are just like quibbles about the details of experiments, and that's you can go into those quibbles. We could do like a 5-hour video on that, but that's not really going to ultimately shift things here or there. I don't know if you think there's any other substantive case they have. To me, it really is like the major case they have is just this assertion that the cortex is required. The reasons of thinking that we have no reason to think that, the reasons they bring to think that are really horrible.
right, yeah. So I think there are some other points that I think we should
Yeah,
discuss.
sure.
But so maybe we can discuss what. Well, we could discuss the other points made in the article, and then I think we should also discuss some of their replies to your arguments. Okay, so Key's big response to cortical generation of pain is to your counterexamples
Mm-hmm.
are, he says, he gives kind of two classes of response, which is, first of all, that you might have the same functions being done by other that
Other parts of the brain that are not the cortex.
right, like via neuroplasticity, I think.
Sure.
And then the second one is just that maybe these children aren't really conscious; they're just sort of like doing very basic activity that are non-conscious.
Wait, just go over exactly what the first one is. Is the first one to say that there's is explained by neuroplasticity?
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, we could go over the So
right. So for example, so in my notes I have he says, quote, a recent review of the literature has revealed that 70% of hydrancephalics have occipital lobe remnants and 40% have frontobasal lobe remnants. Consequently, it is difficult to relate function in the cortex in these children without a very detailed neuroanatomical and physiological analysis. One complaint about Key is I don't think he writes very clearly. At least he writes in a way that's very that's hard. It's hard to get through, But anyways, that's separate.
Oh, I didn't. By the way, I didn't know that he replied. When were these replies generated? Because I wasn't actually where he actually was generating replies to these examples, and who stimulated the reply. Just so I know, like who.
Oh, sorry. This was in his. He mentioned these in his paper, "Why Fish Do Not Feel Pain."
Okay. So he mentioned hydranencephaly.
Yeah.
Hydran. Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, maybe it would be helpful I'll screen share what he said about hydranencephaly.
Sure. Yeah, let me take a look. Yeah, hydranencephaly. Okay. Cerebral cortex revealing that they display variable mix of motor behaviors and smuggling, doing with sound, visual tracking objects. Good. Okay, so he knows that. Okay, on the basis of these observations, concluded the feelings are interpreted with the cortex level of brainstem. However, in contrast to these specific case studies, most hydranencephalic children are more bound and visually blind. Okay, but that's not. That's not. Yeah, no one's disputing that. Nor do they need to dispute that.
Right. That's like saying most people who don't have their hands, aren't. They can't type.
Aren't doing handshakes. Like, okay, yes, we know. Yeah, but that's not the point. On the basis of these observations, it has been concluded that consciousness and feelings as visual qualia are independent of cerebral cortex and arise at the level of the brainstem. Okay, wait a minute. No, that doesn't. Okay, so that's a misstatement of the position. It doesn't mean that they arise at the level of the brainstem. Maybe some people have claimed that, but that's not that's not a position one needs to take. You could.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, on the it has been concluded conscious and arise at the level of the
And it
brains.
lies at the
Right.
level. Yeah, you don't need to believe it arises at the level of the brainstem in order to believe it doesn't require a cerebral cortex. It could arise at a connection between the brainstem and the thalamus, for example. Um, it doesn't need to be at the level of the brainstem. It could be any other. It could be any other non-cortical structure. Um, anyway,
Yeah. Yeah, I think Panksepp and Damasio and
they may have said that.
Carvalho.
Sure, they may have
Yeah.
claimed that, but just to be clear, one doesn't need to claim that. Nor am I even so sure it does arise at the level of the brainstem necessarily. But anyway, however, in contrast to the specific case studies, most high neurotropic children are okay. We went over that, visually blind. In fact, most individuals with this syndrome die in utero or within weeks of birth. Again, not and so like if most people with who had were living in an environment where they had their hands cut off, if they usually died, they couldn't feed themselves, and so they died. So what? What does that tell us? Okay, yeah. The point is that if you're saying it's a requirement, then we shouldn't see any of them. If it's like this universal requirement that consciousness require a cortex, it doesn't matter if it's a rarely. You shouldn't have it, unless you want to say it's not. It's not required. It's just usually required. But then you're in a different ballgame. So pointing out that and again, like it's not surprising most die in birth. Like it's a severe condition. There's many conditions where that result in people being born mentally handicapped that are lost to birth because they die in utero. That doesn't mean they're not
Right, but that doesn't tell us whether the ones that are born are conscious.
Right, exactly. All right. Die in birth. Patients who survive longer are typically in vegetative states. Okay, well, in vegetative state, if by vegetative state he means a non-conscious state, then that's just an assertion. He's begging the question. If he means something else by vegetative state, then I don't know what he means in a way that's going to be relevant.
I guess my sense is vegetative states are like, when you're in a vegetative state, you don't really move. You're sort of like in a coma, basically.
Oh, well, if he's okay, well, that I'm not sure. Okay, well, that I may take contention with. So that he's going to have to, if he means that in terms of like no interaction with the like as a coma patient would have, like the same type of interaction coma patient has, I don't think that's true. Particularly not, again, with the self-fulfilling prophecy point of that paper, particularly not in individuals who are treated and given stimulation as if they do have a cortex. So particularly of the ones who don't fall prey to the self-fulfilling prophecy issue, like other children would, if you deprive them of sensory stimuli, those certainly are not if that's what he means by vegetative state, then I just take that to be a false claim. Like they're not. They're not in the same sort of vegetative state as a coma patient would. They're not like us, but they're not in a coma, and hence unaware of their environments and have spastic quadriparesis. Again, like I'm just going to repeat the same issue. Like again, you're just yes, they're limited in their mobility. No one denies this. What needs to be appreciated?
Right. Yeah, I guess my sense of all these things is he'll say, X is true of lots and lots of them. And the response is either X is true of all of them, but then it's not obvious that X is needed for consciousness. Like, they're all severely mentally impaired, but there are lots of severely mentally impaired people who are conscious. And then if X is instead something like, lots of them die in utero. Well, that's
true of people who are conscious once they're born also. Like,
yeah.
All right. What needs to be appreciated is the heterogeneity in behavioral phenotypes arises from an underlying heterogeneity in the severity and anatomical difference of these children. Wait a minute. That also is not getting to the point, because the mere fact that there is heterogeneity in phenotypes that may arise from the severity in neuroanatomical differences in children, that's only going to be relevant if you're going to beg the question by saying it's the specific damage to the cortex and not anything else that is explaining that heterogeneity from nothing to something. But you haven't shown that. In fact, we have.
Yeah, wait, sorry. Can you just explain what the sentence means?
Yeah. what needs to be appreciated is that the heterogeneity in behavioral phenotypes. So that means there's a variability, there's variation in how much of the things we just mentioned, whether they're tracking objects or interacting with recognizing their parents, there's some of them do it better than others. And he's saying that the fact that some are doing it better than others arises from an underlying heterogeneity, so a variation in the severity of the neuroanatomical deficiencies in these children. Now, so there's 2 points to make here. First of all, unless you're talking about heterogeneity from 0 to some other value, 0 being not conscious, that's all going to be irrelevant, because if they're still conscious and they still or can still feel pain, even if it's less pain, that heterogeneity is not going to make any point of a difference to what the claim is. It's still not going to get you where you need to go. But let's say it is. Let's say the heterogeneity includes 0 pain states or 0 conscious states. Then what you would need to show is that what underlies that heterogeneity is the degree of damage to the cerebral cortex in particular, and not any other type of damage, including lack of stimulation to the other brain structures, i.e. people who treat the children as if they have no cerebral cortex.
Right. So maybe it's right. So it sounds like what he's saying is like, oh, people with more severe hand injuries generally struggle more to type.
Yes.
But then all that shows is that disruption to the hands disrupts ability to type in typical cases, but it doesn't show that the hands are uniquely necessary for typing.
So yeah, if he wants to say that, like, oh wait, these counter examples where they're typing with the feet, they don't type with the feet if the hands are totally removed. If that's true, that goes through. Like if that's true, then that's not a counter example anymore. Because if I'm bringing a counter example of children who type with their feet when the hands are cut off or when the hands don't develop, then if he wants to say, well, they can only type with their feet if they have the hands, if they have some amount of their hand. If he wants to say if that were true, then that's a fair point. But it's not true. There's cases where the cortex is so damaged or so severely damaged, and yet we do see that the cortex is not underlying all that heterogeneity.
Yeah. Should we go to one of the papers that talks about that?
Sure. Let me actually no, I think it was that.
Okay, yeah. So it's just if people want to look at the paper, it's just the consciousness in congenitally decorticate children, developmental vegetative state as self-fulfilling.
And then there's another paper I do want people to look at as well, for this and to refer to. I'm going to shoot you that as well. It's this one.
Sorry, should we look let's see, where in this first paper, so just for people who are not like me, who aren't super familiar with neuroscience, do you want to describe just sort of where in the paper it describes, like what part of the paper describes
Sure.
where it seems sure. it seems like it can't be the cortex playing a role?
Yeah. So let me look at where the.
I guess, yeah, I'll switch the tab to this.
So it would be the cortex. Okay. Cortex basically intact. Okay. So if you look at the imaging, so the first thing to look at is figure 5.
Okay.
In fact, where is figure 5 called out in the paper?
Yeah, I found it.
5. Fig 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So, this is like a subject 3. Gross cesarean section. MRI revealed gross brain malformation, mainly resembling hydroencephality, but partially alobular hypoprosencephaly. The subparenteral, the supratentorial space was empty except for a thin slab of frontal lobe without midline fissure. A repeat scan runs is unchanged. And so this is an example of a this is just one example of what something looks like this. So in this case, there is like a residual lobe. There's a residual part of the cortex. They went with an image like this. Let me find a picture where it's like more pronounced. The point is that you can see that almost all of the cerebral cortex here is just gone. It's not present. And whatever cortex.
Sorry, it's figure 5 that has the cerebral cortex.
Yeah. Okay. If you look at the it has a small residual portion of it, to be precise. There's like most of it's completely gone. But let me see.
So where is this? Like which of the?
If you go to, in this case, if you go to the top left, you can see a portion of the frontal cortex that's residual. There's a small area of frontal cortex that's still present. And then, this does represent some cases of a cerebral cortex that has like a residual cerebral cortex that's remained. There are much more extreme examples where the cortex is either not present at all, or much more residual, or just simply atrophic or not functional. And that's in that other paper I sent you. Let me see if I could pull that up. Ventromedial and medial cortical evidence.
Wait, sorry, which one?
The other paper. There's 2 papers. Did I send you that other paper? Yeah, I did.
Wait, I only see a message of you from.
Sorry. Let me. Okay, consciousness without. Oh, sorry. It's this one. I sent to the wrong person. There you go. Boom. Let me delete that. All right. Let's try the ventromedial occipital and medial cortical matter overlies an intact cerebellum and brainstem, whereas the occipital and some midline cortical, whereas the rest of the cranium is full of hydrocephalic fluid. Let me see examples of complete lack of cerebral cortex.
Yeah. Eddie, just to answer your question in the chat, so if fish don't suffer, how come they squirm when I stab them? The theory would be that they behave aversively, so they but there's no experience accompanying it. Just like you might have a bacteria that sort of like behaves and that like tries to get away, or something that has some sensors that cause it to go in the opposite direction when it's exposed to harmful stimuli. But this doesn't mean the bacteria is conscious. Would be the argument. Though we'll talk about some reasons, some behavioral reasons, I think, to think fish are conscious.
So the description of figure 8. So figure 8 in this other paper, condition is called hydrancephaly, and is unrelated to the far more benign condition called hydrocephalus, in which cortical tissue is compressed by enlarging ventricles, but is present in anatomically distorted form. The loss of cortex must be massive to be designated hydrancephaly. So it's massive. There's a massive portion of the cortex lost. It is seldom complete, sometimes, but seldom complete. It typically corresponds, which means complete being the total cortex is gone. It typically corresponds to the vast but somewhat variable forebrain expanse supplied by the anterior cerebral circulators. Variable remnants of the cortex supplied by the posterior circulation, notably inferior medial occipital, but also basal portions of the temporal cortex and midline cortical tissue along the falx extending to the medial frontal cortex may be spared. The physical presence of some cortical tissue, clearly visible in figure 8, need not mean, however, that this is connected to the thalamus. That's an important point. The white matter loss often interrupts the visual radiations, for instance, or that it is even locally functional. On autopsy, and this is key, such tissue may be found to be gliotic on microscopic examination, or to exhibit other structural anomalies indicating loss of function. So gliosis means that it's when. So in pathology, there are certain things we see when the tissue was dead at the time, and so one thing we can see is there are certain types of certain inflammatory cell inflammations that we see where given tissue is necrotic. And in the brain, there's like an analog to that, a gliosis. There's there's certain cells that infiltrate the brain tissue as an indicator that that tissue was not functional. So the point being here is that even if we do find residual cortical tissue, that there's reasons to believe from histology that that cortical tissue was not functional.
I see. Okay.
And that those are found on autopsy.
Sorry. So, and are we sure that right? So, what you might think is, look, maybe in some people with hydranencephaly, maybe some with hydranencephaly are conscious, and some have a bit of cortical tissue that's non-functional. But are we sure that that of the ones who like smile and recognize faces, that those are the very same ones as the ones which have non-functional cortical tissue?
Yeah. So that question, I don't think most have non-functional cortical tissue. I don't know if we've teased it down to like slicing out the ones that have no cortical tissue at all. But the point being is that even the ones that have the residual cortical tissue, we have independent reasons from different areas of science to believe that that's not explaining the variance that Rose Key is getting at. It's not explaining the heterogeneity in phenotypic presentation, like ability to track or anything. And the reason it's not is because we have reason to believe that it's just either dead tissue or tissue that's not connected to the rest of the brain.
I see. Okay, so we have ones. So we have ones where they're able to track, even though they have dead tissue or unconnected tissue. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's important. I think that's a real challenge for Key's view. Okay. Right. So let's see. Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered the hydranencephaly stuff. So maybe. Yeah. Okay.
Did he say anything else about it? Because we were reading.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Let me go back to it. Okay.
Okay. So yeah. That's the point. The problem is that we have reason to believe that residual tissue, cortical tissue, is not what's accounting for the heterogeneity. Okay. So the whole appreciation of heterogeneity, that point doesn't go through. Typically, most of the children still possess some cerebral cortex. Again, we addressed, suggesting those with more overt behaviors may have more functional cortical tissue. Again, addressed that you have to explain why it's dead tissue on histology, or all the other abnormalities showing that it's not going to integrate with the rest.
Right. So an analogy here might be, they're like, oh, most of the people who type with their toes, most of them still have arms. And we're like, okay, but the arms don't move. They're, the arms are non-functional. Yeah, exactly. And there's no correlation between the arms and the...
Yes, yeah. A recent review of literature revealed that 70% of hydranencephalics have occipital lobe remnants. Again, this will all fall prey to what was said before. 40% of frontobasal remnants. Again, no one denies this. This is just going to fall prey to what I said before. Consequently, it is difficult to rate function of the cortex in children. No, it's not difficult if you have reasons to believe they're not functional in the first place. Without very detailed neuroanatomical and physiological analysis. Okay, well, we actually have neuroanatomical analysis. That paper actually gave autopsy findings. So you're right. It is hard to do it without neuroanatomical analyses, but there are neuroanatomical analyses, and they don't go in your direction. Okay. Including that the cortex does not produce feelings, pain, or pain. That function remains the cortex is reportedly ablated requires at best that the cortex is totally ablated. No, well, it is. So yes, it is, but it is ablated. It's just doesn't have to be missing to be ablated. It can be ablated. There's ways of ablating it without making it disappear. The need for ensuring complete loss of brain region is highlighted by experiments in the rodent olfactory system. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Again, this is all responded to. Is there anything further to this?
Let's see. So let's scroll down. Concluding that the cortex, because that functions away. Okay, this need for ensuring complete loss is high. Okay, putting aside the problems with the legion heterogeneity. Okay, so then they say putting aside the problems associated with lesion heterogeneity. It is well known that the visuomotor behaviors reported in congenitally decorticate children by Schumann are
Mm-hmm.
reflexively controlled by the mid and hindbrain and are not signs of conscious neural processing.
So this is just the same move over again. It's like nociception versus pain. So you can always say this, like from associate visual motor behaviors reported in cortical for human are reflexively controlled. So he's not saying that they're reflexes outright. Notice his language here. He's not saying they are reflexes. He's saying they're there's reflexive control by those portions of the brain, even in non-conscious people. Okay, again, we're not going to disagree there, but this is a move you could always make. You could always make this move by maybe it's some sort of non-conscious sort of arc, not necessarily a classical reflex arc, but some sort of reflex-like behavior that's controlled by a lower lower part of the brain that doesn't result in consciousness. You can always say that. It's going to be just the nociception versus pain again.
Right.
And that just goes back to the first objection. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And then he says, look, the brain stem isn't the origin of emotional feelings like pain because of observation.
It is. Like, you don't need to...
Right. That's just one specific hypothesis for how you might have non-complete control from the cortex, but it's not the only one. Yeah.
And the rest just seems like he's just doing the same move over again. Like, oh, because they smile, giggle, or laugh, that doesn't mean they're really experiencing emotions, because they're motor behaviors and they may be executed involuntarily. You know, there may be some sort of reflex. Like, he's just like, this is just the same repetition of like, the nociception versus pain again. You could always say it. It falls into the prey to the same objection that we raised the first time, the same fork with the symmetry breaker, and you can't have the cortex is the symmetry breaker because that would be question begging.
Yeah. Okay. Should we talk about the second line of evidence that's also related?
Okay, there's a second line of evidence. Go ahead.
So it says, of evidence for non-cortex primacy. So it says, indicated above, the second line of evidence that has been used to suggest that the cortex is not responsible for pain comes from observations of a single human patient who continued to feel pain despite extensive bilateral damage to the insular cortex, as well as more modest lesions to various other brain regions. Damasio et al. 2012, Damasio and Carvalho 2013. Given the insular cortex is a central part of the cortical neural signature of pain, it has been suggested that the insular cortex is therefore not essential for pain, and that the feelings arise subcortically, most likely in the brainstem. This conclusion was based on observations of a single patient without qualitative sensory testing or functional magnetic imaging of the lesion brain during sensory.
So this second line is not even a line I draw on. But by the way, maybe there is something to it. It's not something I've ever. This is a.
Okay. So right. So you don't have. Okay.
I mean, I could evaluate it, but it's not.
I
think the job. Look, if I give a whole bunch of case series with a whole like 20 patient study or something, and then he's attacked. Okay, that's the first line of evidence. And the second line of evidence, well, someone mentioned this one case. Like, all right, I mean, I think you have to deal with the 20, my friend. Like, it's like, and you still haven't done with it. It's more than done. Whether that pans out or not.
Yeah. Okay. So now I guess we can go back to the Rethinking Feminism article. Because there are a few other things that I think are worth discussing. Sure. Okay. So sorry, I lost my place. Okay. So then the third premise is fish and invertebrates lack those neural structures that perform these tasks. They lack a cortex, and no substitute part of the fish or invertebrate brain can perform the task of signal amplification or integration necessary for the firing of a nerve to be felt as pain.
Yeah. So this is just asserting the same thing.
Right. But I think this is even more questionable. Right. So the earlier premise says that the cortex is needed for pain in humans, which it doesn't actually seem like it's true. And then this premise says, first, this premise claims to say not only is the cortex needed for pain in humans, the cortex is needed for pain in all creatures because the cortex performs the following function. It performs signal amplification and integration. And then the point is just, well, first of all, it looks like there's some degree of integration present via like the mushroom body in insects or via parts of the fish brain.
I
right.
think,
So fish.
I think charitably what you would be trying to say, if I can give the most toxically charitable interpretation of this, and I use toxic charitability here, because I don't think being maximally charitable is always a good thing. So if I could be toxically charitable to her, what she would want to say is that fish lack a cortex, but really they lack a palladium. A palladium, the analogous structure. So like reptiles, it has a name for it. It's called a. Sorry, I have to just. I need this.
I had thought my understanding was key.
Pallium. It's a pallium. So she's gonna. You want to say it's not a palladium, a pallium.
Right. My thought was I thought Key and those and like Key and Rose and those people, their view tends to be that birds
they have a pallium. Birds and reptiles, they have a pallium, and that's like
I had thought reptiles theirs is pretty functionally different from ours, so they're generally like less sure about reptiles.
Well, there is, I think they do have some sort of pallium in some sense. I could be wrong with it, but I think so. So they don't. So reptiles and birds don't have a cortex, but they have some sort of analogous structure, and you can call it a pallium. But the thing is, fish don't have that, and so if you take the pallium to be the structure that is required for integration and simple amplification necessary to firing never to be felt as pain, that's true. But of course, that's just going to be the point in contention that the pallium is a structure that is required for the signal amplification and integration necessary for firing nerve to be felt as pain.
Right. It's just right. So the argument, and this is an analogy that a bunch of people gave in their replies to Key, where they said, "Oh, look, in humans, vision requires such and such structures." But that doesn't mean that fish can't see because they don't have those structures. It doesn't mean that octopi can't see. They just have different structures that perform similar functions. And so even if you ended up accepting premise 2 and you thought that in humans the cortex was necessary, you could still very easily reject the argument by saying that while it's necessary in humans, in creatures with very different brains, they have other structures that perform the relevant sort of functions. And so it requires not merely saying that the cortex is necessary in humans, it requires thinking that you've identified the exact reason why the cortex is necessary in humans and being very confident that that implies that because
extrapolates to every other species in life.
Right. Where I mean, it just seems completely insane to me to be so confident in this.
It seems really like I don't like. Let's say we found an alien race that didn't have a cortex. I don't know. Like you might try to symmetry rate by saying there's too much of an evolutionary difference, but still, I mean, the point is just that there's all sorts of creatures that are not related to us and have evolved functions, similar functions, using very different things.
Right. Or imagine that humans didn't develop the cortex until they were like 5 years old. So they sort of had similar behavior, but just before the cortex.
Hypothetically. Yeah.
Right. They just had similar behavior, and then it appeared. Yeah. And then would you be like, even though they behave like other children, you would just suspect that they're not conscious because they can't. I mean that strikes me as kind of insane.
No, it's the whole thing I find to be wholly unpersuasive, and it's about as unpersuasive as the pro-choice arguments, because they are the pro-choice arguments, which is that the pain can't be felt by the fetus because the fetus doesn't have thalamico-cortical integration.
Honestly, these seem less. Well, I don't know
well,
as much about
even in a sense. This is even more extreme of a claim because this extrapolates the whole fucking life on Earth. It's like, okay, well, this is a claim about all life on Earth as this requirement. It's like, what the fuck? Like, So yeah, I mean, if So I don't even think so. Yeah, so I would think it's even more crazy because I think the pro-choice arguments using this are crazy on their own. I think the idea of fetal pain can only be beginning at 26 weeks because thalamico-cortical connections are not there, though. It's like I think that's nuts. But so I think this is even more crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, right. Yeah. I think it's very hard to see how you'd be so confident in this. Um, and so one kind of analog that I was thinking about, um, I think you could just give a very similar argument against fish pain behavior, where you say, look, in humans, like take anything that you think humans don't that you think is indicative of humans having pain, right? So like take anything that you think that the humans lacking a cortex can't do, just behavior wise, that leads you to indicate from their behavior that they're not conscious. And you're like, well, fish can do those things. Then you can't then clearly the cortex is not strictly needed for these kinds of functions. So I think it's needed for consciousness
Right.
functions.
And any move that one would make by trying to explain away those things with the nociception move or any analog of the nociception move like reflex and stuff, you would need to explain why you're doing it here and not in the other case, and you can't invoke the cortex to do that. That's the key thing. It's always going to go back.
Now, the way Key responds to this argument, I found very unpersuasive. Where what he says is, he says, like, look, maybe you can have consciousness be given rise to in some other way, but then you would just need, you need more than a just so story. You need a mechanism. And it's like, I don't need a mechanism to know. Like,
no,
if you're
no,
claiming,
no, this is really bad. No, we don't need to know the mechanism to know consciousness or to have the same amount of reason. Look, we don't even have all the mechanisms panned out for cortex. Like, we don't even know that it could be argued our mechanism understanding of consciousness is very, very poor, or maybe not even really realized to a desirable degree that we would even call it realized in us. But we take it to be that we're conscious. I mean, we haven't really. No, but broadly, this whole move of saying like I need to know the mechanisms of something to infer that strongly that it's present. No, I don't need to know how someone died. Like, there's many different ways people can die. If one wants to claim there's only one possible way someone can die, and every other way you need to know the mechanism, or else it's just so story. Well, no, I mean, all I need to see is a person dead and have reason to believe it's not that reason.
Yeah. So, so let me find what. Wait, okay. Sorry. So here's Fish's response. Key's response. So he says, some commenters incorrectly rearticulated my argument to suggest that any animal without a human cortex can neither exhibit complex behavior nor feel pain.
We didn't do that, straw man.
Yeah. This new and simplified version was subject to interrogation by the laws of logic as well as by common sense, blah, blah, blah. Okay, by decades
of behavioral... That's not an objection we rose.
Yeah. Yeah, so...
Non-mammalian species like birds. No, we already covered that with the pallium.
Yeah. Yeah, wait, let's was there some other place he addressed in the series? Let's see.
It's been a while since I've read these papers. I see all the titles of the papers you're bringing back. I think it's been like 7 years ago when I last read these, or 6 years ago or something.
Yeah. Right. So even if you don't have, I'm okay. I don't remember exactly where he said this, but I thought his reply was very unpersuasive. Where like, even if you don't know the mechanism by which you don't have to know the mechanism. Like an argument of the form X does Y in humans, so therefore You can't do Y in any species unless you do X. And if you do, you better explain the mechanism. When we
Right.
don't even know how X did Y in humans, just
Yeah.
seems completely
Like, right.
preposterous.
Right.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't say that in any like, you know. So, um, you know, so for example, um, you know, required, you know, air is required for life. You know, breathing air is required for life in humans. Um, and until you find out the mechanism of how fish are surviving without breathing air, you can't conclude that fish are surviving. It's like, even if I didn't know the mechanism of how fish are surviving without breathing air, like, I can conclude that they're living.
Right. 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 So, or another analogy, like we don't actually know the mechanism um, by which you get life. We don't know if it's possible to get life outside of carbon.
Oh,
But
yes, yes.
but an argument of the form, definitely it's possible to get life. It's impossible to get life outside of carbon, uh,
And if
because
it,
we don't know how to do it, and because life in the organisms we know requires carbon. That just seems like a very,
right,
a very
unless
overconfident
and
argument.
unless you can give me the mechanism of how that's happening, it's just so story it can't happen. It's like, well, if we observed it, if we observed something that if you found out tomorrow that I was a silicon based life form and not a carbon based life form, you still don't have the mechanism by how silicon based life happened, but you would still conclude I'm alive.
Right. Right. Yes. Yeah. Totally agree. Um. Oh, and I guess one other thing. Well, maybe we'll get to this when we talk about the behavior argument
Mhm.
for fish consciousness. That, um, so so, going through the rethinking feminism article. Oh, I'll have to reshare. Um, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So says some scientists have suggested that the fish brainstem or the optic tectum can sustain conscious perception of fish pain. Merker suggests that the brainstem can support conscious experience. Um, right. Okay. So we've already responded to the
Yeah.
remnants of a cortex argument, and the fact that they're mostly vegetative and moribund doesn't matter
Yep.
any more than the fact that most people who type have hands. Um,
Yeah.
means that. Yeah, and Beatles with a Z. I plan. Don't worry. I plan to write a Substack article about this. I was trying to get Avi to write a Substack article, but
No, I'm not doing that.
Avi
You
can't
never
write,
write one.
unfortunately. Avi doesn't. The problem is Avi doesn't have hands, so he can't write.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. And I haven't developed the neuroplasticity to type with my toes.
right.
So
Okay. So then she says, uh, so right. So yeah, I think we've already broadly addressed this. You don't have to be super confident in like any specific brain region giving rise to consciousness to think that one of them's needed. Um, so, um, okay. So now next, she addresses the argument that fish and invertebrate behavior proves that they experience pain. Um,
is this just going to fall prey to the nociceptive move?
yeah, I think this is some right. Okay, so, um, uh, so her first worry is that she says sometimes the well,
Well,
okay, maybe it
there's
would be
always all right. There's two broad problems that I'll quickly go. So there's some problems in the form of like the study itself has issues. That which is fine. There's studies that have replication issues. There's always going to be studies that have um, uh, that have methodological issues. It doesn't change the fact that there's a lot you can clearly replicate. Like, you can go to a fish right now and you could poke it and see how it responds. Um, just like you can go to a child right now and poke it. Don't do it, but you can see how the child responds. And so those are the sorts of things. There's enough there that we already are going to agree on. So just pointing out quibbles of methodological flaws and replication issues, that's not going to do much for me based on what we already have. And then with whatever is residual, that is just going to fall prey to the nociceptive issue, to the nociception versus pain the response, which is going to, which we already went over. So I
Yeah.
let's see if that just is falls prey to either of those things.
Right. Okay. So she says, one, critics of Snowden have pointed out that the study and other commonly cited studies fail to replicate
Yeah.
systems.
So
Key results in the study in which trout reacted acid injected into their lips failed to replicate. Yeah, I haven't looked very much at
it was
whether
the
that.
it's like they injected substance into the fish lips, and they observed like some fish trying to like rub their like swim into like some the tank or gravel or something to sort of like soothe it in the same way we would soothe our pain with the by rubbing. Um, uh,
Wow.
yeah, it again whether that study pans out or not is going to do very little for me, because I don't need to think that fish rub soothe as a way of soothing their pain. Um, like whether that's true or not, like that's going to do very little to my credence about fish feeling pain.
Yeah. So I guess maybe what are some of the behavioral results favoring fish
Yeah,
consciousness?
the most basic ones that we would think in any other species. Like if you stab a fish, it runs, it squirms, it runs away. If you try to, if you inflict pain, if you inflict all the things we already recognize inflict pain on fish, they're going to engage in behaviors to get away from that. They'll squirm. And if you do it enough, they'll have some memory of it. They'll recognize like, oh, here it comes again. I got to get the F away from this. And they'll go away before it happens. Um, just like other animals that presumably Rose or Key recognized to be sentient do. So
Yeah.
that to me, that's the thing that is persuasive for pain behavior, not whether they rub their lips the right way or not. Like rather
Yeah.
than,
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, so I find that right. So that's uh yeah. So I find yeah. I'd have to actually. I would be curious. Let's see. Is there a link to uh the key results in the study? Trout failed to replicate. Let's see. Does this article? Uh, let's see. Snedden.
it just does very little. I mean, the point being is that even if it does fail to replicate, it just doesn't matter. Because it's not replicating just to be clear on what's failing to replicate. What's failing to replicate is not whether the fish are behaving in the way I described. What's failing to replicate is the fish's response after that has been a substance has been injected to them, is whether they're engaging in self-soothing behavior by rubbing their lips against the tank or some other object. That could be not.
Yeah, wait, I can't even find where it says, and I might, let's see, wait, so the Snedden paper, let's see, she says that it's Snedden, okay, the lip injection study, let's see, so the lip injection study was, let's see, this was Snedden 2003.
Yeah.
The conclusions of
the other
yeah.
issue here is that the other issue I want to mention is that this sort of rubbing behavior is, my understanding, is largely a function of type C nerve fibers, so which corresponds to a slow agonizing type of pain, a slow like nagging pain, rather than alpha type A type nociceptors, which correspond to a sharp stabbing pain. So it's true that fish do have less type C nerve fibers compared to type A nociceptive fibers, and so that sort of behavior, that rubbing, that self-soothing rubbing pain, like if you cut, so you know how like if you get a cut on your hand or whatever, you'll feel there's two phases. You'll get a sharp feeling, but then you'll get that nagging, gnawing feeling. The rubbing behavior, when people rub their cuts after or whatever, or injuries, that is mainly due to a suppression of the type C, the type or type 3, type C nociceptive fibers, those slow twitch, the slower firing nerves that correspond to the agony, that the nagging type of pain. Now, if Now, that might not be as relevant in fish. That's fine. They're still going to, that's not going to address the sharp stabbing pain that they clearly feel. So even if, it turns out that they're not rubbing they're engaging in the type of soothing behavior for slow firing nerves, for nagging pain, that's not that surprising. They have less of them. They have less of them that they'd want to soothe anyway.
Right. And also, right, so that's true. The other thing is, so the study, it did replicate, right, so I think it looks like fish feel much less and maybe not any of the like long-term aching pain, but they so long as they feel the immediate pain, right? And I think that's more consistent with the evidence. And then even there, regarding them,
but by the way, that in and of itself explains the entirety of the failure to replicate.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Right. And also, so there was replicating that. So the other study, I found it, and it described that. So the author of the paper says, different individuals have different pain tolerances, and this is a possible explanation for the variation in response to the fish after being injected with the acetic acid. Some have a higher pain tolerance or higher nociceptive threshold. Possible, right? So they didn't see any rocking or rubbing behavior, but like maybe it's only some of the fish rock or rub, like, or maybe
right. I don't know. Did they use the same species of fish? Did they use the same age?
I think they did. Yeah. I think they also. Yeah. I think they used the same
concentration and everything, same substance. Yeah. So
by the way, and they still, the fish, even in the replication, the fish still seemed distressed. At least it didn't last as long, but like the fish. It describes that the fish displayed various instances of pain behavior. Right. So it seems way over.
Another possible explanation is that, just some people don't know how to soothe those things by rubbing. Like even in humans, like some humans have learned over time that if they rub an aching area, that they can suppress they don't consciously know that they're suppressing those fibers, but they've learned over time that it gives them some relief. So they do it. But some people don't know that. Sometimes some fish might not know that. But regardless of whatever it is, even if it's the case that the whole first experiment was bunk, and
there
is no nagging feeling, it doesn't matter.
It would be one thing if there were like, dozens of different ones that didn't replicate. So like at some point you just have to seriously consider the hypothesis, like, oh, maybe Sneddon, who's behind a lot of the studies, is just this like crazy pathological liar. But if it's just one that fails to replicate, where there are all sorts of alternative explanations,
we're at best, if everything is bunk, it's just one specific type of pain.
Right. Yeah.
That's not all of pain. It's like it's not even the ones I'm really most concerned about in many ways. But sure.
Yeah. The evidence I found particularly good in fish. So. So
by the way, I am going to have to run soon. So,
oh yeah, sorry.
If there's anything more pressing, that we haven't covered.
Yeah. I guess one argument is,
C fibers again. Like, we're not saying fish have C fibers, so they most, again, going right back into the nociception versus pain issue.
Yeah,
there's a lot of repetition here. It's like very frustrating when people get this. When I'm not. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I guess one other argument for fish consciousness that I find pretty persuasive against the kind of like the Rose style arguments is these arguments would also, if correct, prove that octopi and cuttlefish aren't conscious. And like cuttlefish pass the mirror test. Octopi are like smarter than young children. Now, maybe they just behave in various ways as if they're conscious, despite not being conscious. Just coincidentally, they display lots and lots.
It's the nature's coincidental AI,
Yes. Right. So I guess the takeaway from the behavior stuff is, you could have a thing that's non-conscious but behaves in some ways as if it's conscious. But if you just see time and time again that it behaves in exactly the ways you would expect if it were conscious, then it starts to look like what are the odds that the
And you need,
non-conscious system
yeah.
would produce response to analgesics, would response preferentially seeking out analgesics, would produce
and even if you want to, even if you want to, stalking horse that against the non ones, you're always going to get the problem of like the ultimate problem for me is that it's always going to result in the same thing I mentioned before. You're saying that these ones are conscious. You're saying these ones aren't conscious. It's not. They exhibit very similar behaviors, and it seems like you're at the end of the day, your only symmetry breaker to appeal to is the cortex, which is under contention. So your only move there is really to beg the question.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, I think we're broadly in agreement. Yeah, I guess just to discuss briefly some more of the evidence that fish are conscious. So one line is fish, they seem to seek out painkillers. So if there's a painkiller in some region, fish are in pain, they'll seek out that region in a way they won't. They're in pain. Fish display reinforcement learning. So if fish get electric shocks when they're in some region, then they avoid that region long term. Fish normally so pain distracts creatures, and so if you have if you start normally I'm scared of spiders, but if you start torturing me, then I will stop being scared of spiders because I'm too busy focusing on the being tortured. And so fish are scared of new objects, but then if you inflict pain on them, then they stop being scared of new objects. They make various preferential trade-offs. So trout like hang out with their friends, and they make complicated trade-offs between this and hang out with their friends. They can navigate mazes and do all sorts of complicated things. Looks like maybe they even dream. They can remember things for months or years. Overall, there just seems to be a lot of different facts that seem to point in the direction of fish pain. And so overall, it seems like the most reasonable conclusion is that fish feel pain.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe the final point to end on is just if you think there's like if you're uncertain about this, I think it's at least like just totally obvious that the key arguments should not establish anything like certainty. And so if you're uncertain about this, well, you shouldn't risk like inflicting mass deaths and slaughter and suffering on trillions of beings. Like if you're not sure if they're conscious, that's a reason to take their interest very seriously. So yeah, thanks. Anyways, thanks for doing this, Avi.
Sure.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, everyone. I guess I'll end the stream. All right.
Peace. All right. Take care, guys.